Donald Trump today vowed to impose a 200% tariff on John Deere's imports.
Just back in June, John Deere announced that they were relocating specific production lines to facilities in Mexico. Now, Donald Trump disagreed with this decision and left a significant threat that would ultimately affect the company's bottom line.
I'm just notifying John Deere right now. If you do that, we're putting a 200% tariff on everything that you want to sell into the United States.
Everyone thought American agriculture had a safety net, strong brands, steady equipment, familiar routines. But when John Deere froze production without a single warning, it exposed just how fragile the system really is. This wasn't just a company decision, it was a declaration. What pushed America's most trusted farm brand to pull the plug? Who gets hurt when parts stop moving and fields go silent? And how did a trade war thousands of miles away trigger chaos in the heartland? Stick around, because the future of farming just changed, and no one is safe. Laid off, let down, and left behind. This wasn't just about factories, it was about family legacies. In towns like Waterloo and Ebook, John Deere was more than an employer. It was the economic engine, the local hero, the source of Friday night lights and Sunday church donations. So when layoffs began, the emotional toll hit harder than any economic chart could measure. More than 4,500 jobs have been cut since the year 2015. Just this year alone, nearly 200 factory workers in Iowa lost their jobs. For many, it was the first pink slip in a family history defined by green. Local businesses that once thrived off John Deere paychecks started closing their doors. Diners sat empty. Tool shops collected dust. A domino effect spread across towns that had already been fighting to stay alive. One closure led to another. Committees, and they won. States began passing legislation forcing John Deere to release repair manuals and diagnostics. But for many farmers, the damage was already done. The image of self-reliance had been replaced with digital dependency. And while Deere scrambled to adjust its policy, competitors moved in. Kubota, AGCO, and Case YH didn't just offer similar horsepower. They offered freedom. Freedom to fix, freedom to choose. It didn't just spark outrage with layoffs, it ignited fury by turning simple repairs into costly nightmares. Their digital lockdown on repair rights drew a line in the soil that farmers refused to cross. For decades, farmers relied on their own hands to fix their machines. Then came the software wall. Now, even minor repairs required a Deere-certified technician, proprietary tools, or a service fee that could double the cost of a simple fix. The backlash birthed the Right to Repair movement. Across the Midwest, farmers began lobbying lawmakers, storming town halls, and testifying before until the very character of rural America began to shift. And it wasn't just economic, it was cultural. Entire towns built around these factories were now asking, what happens when the heartbeat stops? Inside the homes of laid-off workers, uncertainty gave way to resentment. Generations who once saw John Deere as a legacy now saw it as a liability. Loyalty turned to anger, and that anger began to organize. But the real betrayal hadn't come from pink slips, it came from locked hoods. The tractor you can't touch. Imagine owning a machine that you cannot fix. John Deere, freedom to farm without a tech leash. And just like that, loyalty shifted. What had once been unimaginable, walking away from the green and yellow, became inevitable. But for some, walking away wasn't a choice. It was survival. Abandonment at scale. Innovation was once their legacy. Now it's their excuse. As John Deere doubled down on automation, digital control, and cost restructuring, farmers and workers alike began to see the writing on the barn wall. This wasn't about improvement, it was about escape. The company insisted the freeze was temporary, a pause to reset strategy, reallocate resources, and weather economic headwinds. But for rural America, it felt permanent, like a chapter had closed. Small dealerships reported slower traffic. Used equipment listings surged online. Meanwhile, foreign brands that once struggled to gain footing in the U.S. market started gaining ground. What had once been seen as unthinkable, choosing anything but Deere, was now common sense. All it took was a shift in perspective. John Deere was no longer the farmer's partner. It was the outsider. And once that shift happened, even a loyal legacy couldn't stop the flood. Farmers began to build networks to source parts, swap software hacks, and circumvent corporate controls. What was once a customer base became a resistance movement. But far beyond the fields and factory towns, a new pressure was mounting. one that John Deere couldn't ignore, no matter how far south it moved production. We went beyond the press releases and dug up what really happened after the production freeze. Now you're ahead of the headlines, and miles ahead of the mainstream take. If that feels valuable, return the favor with a like or subscribe. Crop prices crushed overnight. The numbers revealed something no one expected. Corn, soybeans, and wheat, the foundational crops of American agriculture, collapsed in price. For farmers, it wasn't just a bad quarter. It was a total inversion of the economy they'd relied on for survival. Since the year 2022, corn prices have plummeted by 37%. Soybeans fell by 24%. Wheat by 35%. And with those plunges came a cascade of decisions no farmer ever wants to make. The tractors stayed parked. The harvesters went unsold. Equipment orders that had been penciled in were suddenly erased. Every input, from diesel fuel to fertilizer, still cost more, but the return per acre was evaporating. This wasn't just a seasonal downturn. This was the entire agricultural pricing model breaking under global strain. And in that chaos, John Deere's most dependable customer segment went quiet. Not because they wanted to walk away, but because they had no choice. For John Deere, the math was brutal. No buyers meant no production. No production meant layoffs, facility slowdowns, and escalating investor pressure. And the freeze on American manufacturing, it wasn't just strategic, it was inevitable. But behind those numbers was something more strategic, a deliberate shift that no farmer voted for. Made in Mexico, branded in America. This wasn't just outsourcing, it was a strategic escape plan. When John Deere announced it would move part of its manufacturing to Mexico, it wasn't future tense. It was already in motion. A new facility, backed by a $55 million investment, was breaking ground. Contracts were signed. Machines were en route. Why Mexico? The advantages were hard to ignore. Labor costs were 70% lower. Logistical proximity to Latin American export markets was ideal. And most importantly, the region offered insulation from volatile U.S. political and labor conditions. The facility wasn't designed to replace everything. Deere insisted its core production, large tractors and combines, would remain in Iowa and Illinois. What Mexico would build were mid-frame skid steers and compact loaders, the fastest growing equipment segment. For Deere's board, it was about flexibility. In Mexico, ports were faster, freight was cheaper, and supply chain chaos could be managed with local redundancy. It wasn't just payroll savings, it was strategic decentralization. But for farmers and workers in America, it felt like betrayal wearing a necktie. What they didn't know was that a political powder keg was about to explode. The tariff ultimatum. Trump didn't threaten a company, he threatened an empire. Within days of the Mexico expansion becoming public, President Donald Trump stood behind a podium in Iowa and made his position brutally clear. If John Deere exported manufacturing jobs, he'd impose a 200% tariff on every imported unit. This wasn't rhetorical grandstanding. It was a direct economic threat. Trump had already proven he could move markets with trade policy. Just ask General Motors, Harley-Davidson, or Apple. The logic was simple. If Deere wanted to build in Mexico, then they'd pay the price to re-enter American markets. A 200% import tariff would effectively kill profit margins and make their own equipment unaffordable to U.S. buyers. Wall Street reacted immediately. John Deere's stock dropped by over 1.5% in after-hours trading. Analysts sounded alarms over supply chain risks and possible retaliatory actions from trade partners. The industry braced itself. Deere issued a measured reply. Only 5% of its total North American production would shift. Most of its marquee products would still be U.S. built, but the damage was already done. A media firestorm erupted. Supporters hailed Trump as defending American jobs. Critics warned it would trigger a wider trade war. But amid the noise, something deeper was happening. Because while Washington fought over tariffs, Main Street fought over trust. A nation at war with itself. This wasn't just a policy disagreement, it was a cultural fault line. Across social media, town halls, and radio shows, a new civil war broke out, not between states, but between allegiances. Some defended Deere. They argued that global competition required global operations. Without cost reduction, Deere could fall to foreign rivals. That survival sometimes requires sacrifice. Others were furious. They saw a company born in the heartland abandoning its own workforce. They saw small towns collapsing while Deere built new facilities abroad. And worst of all, they saw political leaders divided over whose side to take. Senators from red states began pressuring Deere to reverse course. The House Agriculture Committee threatened hearings. Federal contract reviews were floated. Meanwhile, Deere's lobbyists flooded Capitol Hill with briefings, impact memos, and reassurances. They warned of unintended consequences. Tariffs wouldn't just hurt Deere. They'd hurt the very farmers Trump claimed to protect. Raising prices on American-made equipment by targeting partial imports could backfire spectacularly. But the debate wasn't just economic, it was philosophical. What does it mean to be an American company in a global economy? Can you optimize for shareholders and still honor the people who built you? And just as that question reached a fever pitch, a new force entered the battlefield, because far away from Washington,